They mistook my silence for submission, sitting with a plastic fork while 33 relatives used heirloom silver. I listened to my mother call me a failed investment, but they forgot what I do for a living. While they bragged about Aspen, they ignored the cheap bag at my feet. It doesn't hold tissues. It holds proof that this entire lavish dinner was paid for with my stolen credit score. Tonight is the last time they sleep soundly. My name is Grace Lockridge, and as I stood before the oak double doors of my parents' estate in Lake Forest, I could feel the biting Chicago wind whip through the thin fabric of my coat. It was 5 degrees below zero, a temperature that usually kept sane people indoors. But tonight was different. Tonight was the 30th anniversary of Lockridge Estates, the family real estate empire, and attendance was mandatory. Or at least, it was mandatory if you wanted to maintain the illusion that we were a functioning family unit. I checked my watch. I was exactly on time. 7 o'clock sharp. Yet as I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped into the foyer, I felt less like a daughter returning home and more like a process server delivering bad news. The contrast between the freezing gale outside and the interior of the mansion was jarring. The air inside smelled of expensive pine, roasted duck, and the distinct, metallic scent of old money. The foyer was already crowded. 33 relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, and second cousins twice removed were mingling with champagne flutes in hand. The noise was a dull roar of polite laughter and the clinking of crystal. When I stepped fully into the light, the conversation did not stop. But it certainly stuttered. Heads turned, eyes scanned my off-the-rack dress and my wind-blown hair. They looked at me with the same vague annoyance one might direct at a catering server who had walked through the front door instead of the service entrance. No one moved to take my coat. My mother's hired help was busy taking mink stoles from my Aunt Caroline, so I shook the melting snow off my shoulders and found a wire hanger on the far end of the rack. Squeezing my damp wool jacket between 2 cashmere overcoats that probably cost more than my car, I made my way to the dining room. The seating arrangement was a masterclass in passive-aggressive architecture. The main table was a long mahogany expanse, set with the family's sterling silver, heavy linens, and elaborate floral centerpieces. My parents, Preston and Eleanor, sat at the head and foot. My sister Bethany and my brother Tanner were seated prominently in the middle, flanked by the most influential uncles and the wealthier cousins. And then there was my spot. Tucked away in the corner, near the swinging door that led to the kitchen, was a small, square card table. It wobbled slightly when I placed my hand on it. There was no linen tablecloth, just the bare wood surface. While the others had heavy silver forks and knives, my place setting consisted of high-grade plastic cutlery, the kind you might see at a backyard barbecue. Not a black tie anniversary dinner. It was a deliberate humiliation, a physical manifestation of my standing in the Lockridge hierarchy. I sat down, my back to the drafty window, and watched them. Dinner was a blur of self-congratulation. My mother, Eleanor, tapped her spoon against her glass, the sharp sound cutting through the room. She stood up, her diamonds catching the light of the chandelier. She launched into her speech about prosperity and unity, words that sounded hollow to anyone who actually looked at the company's balance sheets. She spent 10 minutes praising Bethany for her recent engagement and her success as a lifestyle influencer, ignoring the fact that Bethany's lifestyle was entirely funded by company credit cards. She then pivoted to Tanner, lauding his entrepreneurial spirit for a startup that had not generated a single dollar of revenue in 2 years. She did not look at me once, not even a glance toward the corner, a cousin from the East Coast, a man I hadn't seen in 5 years, leaned back in his chair and caught my eye across the room. He seemed to feel a twinge of pity. He cleared his throat and asked, loud enough to carry over the silence, how work was going for me. Before I could open my mouth, my father cut in. Preston waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. He said not to ask, claiming I only did menial paperwork that was too boring to discuss at a celebration. He laughed, and a ripple of obedient chuckles went through the room. They thought I was a clerk. They thought I filed tax returns for a living. They had no idea that my menial paperwork involved forensic audits for Stratford and Finch, tracing financial fraud for some of the biggest conglomerates in the country. The main course was cleared, and the mood shifted. It was time for business. Eleanor remained standing. She smoothed the front of her dress and announced that in light of the 30-year milestone, she and Preston had decided to restructure the family trust and the future ownership of the company. The room went deadly silent. This was what they were all here for, the money. Eleanor spoke clearly. She detailed the shares going to Bethany and Tanner. She outlined the dividends for the extended family, and then she turned her body slightly, finally acknowledging the corner of the room where I sat. She said that regarding Grace, they had made a difficult decision. She stated that I would not be included in the new trust, nor would I inherit any shares of Lockridge Estates. Her reasoning was that I had consumed far too many family resources in the past without providing any return on investment. She called me a liability. The silence that followed was suffocating. 33 pairs of eyes fixed on me, waiting for the outburst. They wanted tears. They wanted a scene. They wanted me to beg. I did not move. I did not blink. Preston leaned forward, his face flushed with wine and arrogance. He added that they were doing this to teach me independence. He called it the final lesson. I pushed my chair back. The scrape of the metal legs against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the room. I stood up, smoothing my skirt. I looked at my mother, then at my father. I kept my face completely neutral. I told them simply that I thanked them for clarifying everything. I turned and walked toward the door. The walk felt long, but my steps were steady. As I passed Bethany, she leaned in, her breath smelling of expensive Merlot. She whispered a warning not to come back begging for money. When reality hit me, I didn't respond. I walked out of the dining room, retrieved my damp coat from the rack, and stepped out into the night. The storm had worsened, snow coming down in thick sheets, but the cold felt cleansing now. I walked to my car, a 10-year-old gray sedan that sat like a blemish among the Mercedes and Range Rovers in the driveway. I got in and slammed the door. Shutting out the wind, I didn't cry. Instead, a low, cold laugh escaped my throat. It wasn't a laugh of madness. It was a laugh of relief. They had just severed the last tie. They had just freed me. I pulled my phone from my purse. The screen glowed in the darkness of the car. I opened a specialized application I had coded myself, a passive network sniffer I had activated the moment I walked through the door. It had been running for 2 hours, latching onto the unsecured guest Wi-Fi that my parents' entire home network was bridged to. The progress bar showed 100% complete. I had the handshake data. I had the IP addresses. I had everything I needed to begin the real audit. I shifted the car into gear and drove away, leaving the warmth of the mansion behind for the cold truth of the numbers. My apartment in downtown Chicago was a sanctuary of grayscale and silence. It was everything my parents' estate was not. There were no velvet drapes to hide the dust, no heirlooms to weigh down the shelves, and certainly no family portraits smiling falsely from the mantel. I locked the door behind me, the heavy deadbolt sliding into place with a satisfying thud. The drive home had been a 40-minute exercise in controlled breathing, allowing the adrenaline of the confrontation to dissipate so that the cold logic could take over. I kicked off my heels and walked straight to my desk. This was my command center. While my family believed I spent my days filing inconsequential tax returns for bored suburbanites, the reality was vastly different. At Stratford and Finch, I was not a clerk. I was a hunter. I specialized in forensic auditing, tracking the invisible digital footprints left by embezzlers, money launderers, and corporate fraudsters. I had spent the last 7 years taking down CEOs who thought they were smarter than the algorithm. My parents thought I was a disappointment because I chose a salary over equity, but they failed to understand that I traded risk for power, the power of knowing. I sat down and woke up to my custom-built tower. The 3 monitors flickered to life, bathing the dark room in a cool blue glow. I did not feel sad. Sadness was a luxury for people who had hope. I had data. The dinner had been a tactical necessity. I had not gone there for the turkey or the abuse. I had gone for the network. While my mother was droning on about family unity, My phone had been quietly handshaking with their router, logging the MAC addresses of every device connected to the home network. I needed to confirm the static IP address of the estate to cross-reference it with the anomalies I had been seeing in the periphery of my own financial existence. I pulled up the logs. There it was, the digital fingerprint of the Lockridge mansion. I copied the string of numbers and pasted it into my analysis software. Then, I initiated a deep dive into public property records and the dark corners of credit reporting databases that usually required a subpoena to access. The screen filled with lines of code and cascading windows. I felt the familiar hum of the chase. First, I queried my own name, not just Grace Lockridge, but every variation of it, paired with my social security number. The results hit the screen like a shotgun blast. I stared at the monitor, my eyes narrowing. I was listed as the primary owner of 5 residential properties on the south side of Chicago. I clicked on the street views. They were derelict row houses, boarded up, with caved-in roofs and overgrown yards. These were not investments. They were shell casings. My parents were using my clean credit history to act as a straw buyer. They bought these worthless properties at inflated prices from shell companies they likely controlled, probably to wash dirty money or to manufacture losses to offset their tax liabilities. I drilled down into the financing. The mortgages were subprime, with interest rates that hovered near 12%. They were ticking time bombs, and my name was on the detonator. I switched tabs to my credit report. On the surface, my score was respectable. That was the trick. If they ruined my credit completely, the banks would stop lending. They had to keep the host alive to feed off it. I found a shadow profile attached to my social security number. It was a file that banks sometimes maintained for high net worth individuals with multiple addresses. This profile linked my identity not to my downtown apartment, but to the Lake Forest estate. It was a masterclass in debt churning. I saw a business line of credit for $50,000 taken out 2 years ago. It had been paid off by a new loan for $55,000 6 months later. That loan was then refinanced into a $70,000 equipment lease for a company called Tanner Tech Ventures. My brother's failed startup. They were rolling the debt over and over, keeping it current just enough to avoid a default flag, ballooning the principal while I remained completely unaware. I needed to prove authorship. Possession of the data was not enough. I needed to prove who clicked the mouse. I pulled up the digital loan agreements for the most recent property acquisition, a teardown on State Street purchased 4 months ago. I zoomed in on the electronic signature. It was a perfect digital replica of my handwriting. Too perfect. It was a stamp, not a live signature. I accessed the metadata of the PDF file. The document had been created and signed on a device named Eleanor MacBook Pro. I cross-referenced the creation timestamp with the IP logs I had just extracted from the dinner. It was a match. The document was signed from the master bedroom of the Lockridge estate on a Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. I was at my office in the Loop at that exact time, logged into the Stratford and Finch secure server. I had an unbreakable alibi. My mother had committed federal wire fraud and identity theft from the comfort of her Egyptian cotton sheets. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the leather creaking in the silence. The scale of it was breathtaking. They hadn't just used me. They had consumed me. I was not a daughter to them. I was a resource, a human shield against their own financial incompetence. Then, a notification popped up on my personal banking app, alerting me to a pending transaction on a card I didn't think I had. I frowned and opened the window. It was a platinum credit card issued by a private wealth bank 3 weeks ago. I had never applied for it. I looked at the transaction history. There was only one pending charge, processed yesterday. The charge was for $12,450. The merchant was Exquisite Catering Events. I stopped breathing for a second. The rage that flared in my chest was white-hot. The dinner, the heirloom silver, the champagne, the roast duck, the staff who refused to take my coat, the very chair I sat on while they disowned me. They had paid for their celebration of excluding me using a credit card they stole my identity to open. I had literally financed my own humiliation. I closed my eyes and let the anger crystallize into something useful. something cold and sharp. This was no longer a family dispute. This was a crime scene. I opened a new encrypted folder on my secure drive. I needed a name for the investigation. I thought about my father's arrogance, my mother's delusion, and my sister's greed. They thought they were untouchable, soaring high above the laws that governed ordinary people. They thought the sun would never melt their wax wings. I typed 2 words into the file name bar, Project Icarus. I began to drag and drop the files, the property deeds, the loan agreements, the IP logs, the credit report, the catering receipt. The sun was going to come out tomorrow, and the heat was going to be unbearable. I saved the file, the sound of the keystroke echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. The audit had officially begun. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Rusty Spoon, a 24-hour diner on the edge of the industrial district, buzzed with a sound like an angry insect. It was the kind of place where the menus were sticky with syrup and the coffee tasted like battery acid. It was also the last place on earth anyone would look for a member of the Lockridge family. That was exactly why I chose it. I sat in a vinyl booth near the back, watching the door. My Uncle Silas walked in 5 minutes late. He looked smaller than I remembered from the dinner party, at the mansion, surrounded by the grandeur of the estate. He had just seemed quiet. Here, in the unforgiving glare of the diner lights. He looked broken. His coat was a few years out of style, the cuffs fraying slightly, and his shoulders were hunched as if he expected the ceiling to collapse on him at any moment. He slid into the booth opposite me, his eyes darting around the room nervously. He looked at me, then down at his hands. He asked why I wanted to meet him here. He kept his voice low. He said that if Preston knew he was talking to me, he would cut him off. I signaled the waitress for 2 coffees. I looked at my uncle, really looked at him. He was my father's younger brother, but he had none of Preston's polished veneer. Silas was the family secret, the one they kept around for pity, or so I had always thought. I told him that Preston was not going to cut him off. I told him that Preston needed him too much. Silas laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He shook his head. He said I did not understand. He said he was nothing to the company. He claimed he was just a charity case. He told me he received a monthly stipend to stay out of the way and not embarrass the family name. I reached into my bag. I did not pull out a tissue or a checkbook. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, a printout from the tax investigation I had conducted the night before. I slid it across the chipped formica table. I asked him to explain the document. Silas squinted at the paper. He adjusted his glasses. As he read, the color drained from his already pale face. His hands started to shake, rattling the paper against the table surface. He stammered. He asked what this was. He asked why his name was next to a tax lien for $250,000. I leaned in, keeping my voice steady, utilizing the tone I used when interviewing nervous whistleblowers. I explained that according to the IRS, he was the sole proprietor of a consulting firm called Omega Solutions. I told him that this firm had absorbed $250,000 in tax liabilities from Lockridge Estates last year and had failed to pay a single cent to the government. Silas dropped the paper as if it burned him. He whispered that he did not have company. He said he had never heard of Omega Solutions. I pressed him. I asked if he had signed anything recently, any documents Preston or Eleanor put in front of him. Silas looked out the window at the gray slush in the parking lot. His eyes watered. He took a long, shaky breath. He told me about last winter. He had been in the hospital with pneumonia. He was weak, on heavy medication, drifting in and out of sleep. He said Preston came to visit. It was the only time Preston had visited. He said Preston brought a stack of papers. Preston told him they were just insurance forms, updates to the family medical policy, so Silas could keep his coverage. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. My father had gone to his sick brother's bedside, not to comfort him, but to frame him. I told Silas the truth. I told him that Preston tricked him. I explained that those were not insurance forms. They were incorporation documents and liability transfers. I told him that Preston and Eleanor were using his identity as a dumping ground for their toxic debt. Silas buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. He whispered that he was going to go to jail. He said he could not survive jail. I reached across the table and placed my hand on his arm. It was the first time I had touched a family member with genuine affection in years. I told him to look at me. He raised his head, his eyes red and terrified. I promised him that he was not going to jail. I told him that I was a forensic auditor and I knew exactly how to fix this. But I told him I needed his help. I needed to know what else they were planning. Silas wiped his eyes with a paper napkin. He looked around again to ensure no one was listening. He leaned in close. He told me that I needed to move fast. He said he overheard Preston and Eleanor talking in the study during the party. Before dinner started, he said they were selling the company. I froze. Selling Lockridge Estates, it was the family's crown jewel. Silas nodded frantically. He said they were not just selling it, they were stripping it. He told me they were setting up a trust in the Cook Islands. They planned to liquidate the legitimate assets, move the cash offshore, and leave the shell of the company here in Chicago to implode. He said the bankruptcy would wipe out the creditors, but the debts attached to individuals like the ones on my credit report and the tax lien on Silas would remain. They were going to cut the parachute cords and let us crash while they floated away to a tax haven with millions. I realized then that my timeline had collapsed. I did not have months to build a case. I had days, maybe weeks. I asked Silas about the records. I knew that digital trails could be scrubbed or encrypted, but my father was old-fashioned in his paranoia. He always kept physical backups of the sensitive material, things he did not trust to the cloud. Silas hesitated. He said that Preston kept the old files in the archives at the original office building downtown, the one they abandoned 5 years ago but never sold. I asked if he could get me in. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a key ring. It held a single, brass key. He said Preston forgot he had this. He said he used to go there to sleep when he lost his apartment 10 years ago. He said he knew where the boxes were. He said they were in the basement, behind the boiler room, marked as old tax returns. I took the key. It felt heavy and cold in my palm. This was it. This was the smoking gun. I looked Silas in the eye. I told him he had to trust me. I told him to go home, keep his head down, and act like nothing had changed. I promised him that when this blew up, I would make sure he was listed as a cooperating witness, not a co-conspirator. I swore to him that I would protect him. Silas looked at me with a mixture of fear and awe. He said that I looked just like my grandmother. He said she was the only one who had a spine, and he saw that steel in me now. He slid a manila envelope across the table. He said he grabbed this from the study that night because he saw his name on it. He was too scared to read it. I opened the envelope. Inside were yellowed pages, carbon copies of loan applications from 20 years ago. I scanned them quickly. My heart hammered against my ribs. These weren't just bad loans. These were forgeries dating back decades. This proved a pattern of behavior. It proved that the fraud was not a desperate measure of recent years, but the very foundation of the Lockridge empire. I put the documents in my bag. I stood up and threw a $20 bill on the table for the coffee we didn't drink. I told Silas to stay safe. I told him to answer his phone only if it was me. I walked out of the diner into the biting wind. The city looked different now. It was no longer just a cold metropolis. It was a battlefield. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting alone. I had an ally, a terrified, broken ally, but an ally nonetheless. I clutched my bag tighter, feeling the weight of the yellowed papers against my hip. I had the map to the bodies. Now, I just had to grab a shovel and start digging. I did not go to the police station. That was the mistake amateurs made. They believed that justice was a straight line, a simple matter of filing a report and waiting for a detective to knock on the door. But I knew better. In Chicago, especially in the circles my parents moved in, the police were not an instrument of justice. They were a service industry. My father, Preston, played golf every Sunday with the precinct captain. A criminal complaint filed by a disgruntled daughter would disappear into a shredder before the ink was even dry, dismissed as a domestic misunderstanding or a hysterical outburst. To kill a beast this large, you do not stab it in the hide. You starve it. You cut off the blood supply. And for the Lockridges, blood was capital. I sat at my desk, the glow of the monitors illuminating the dark apartment. I opened a secure, encrypted browser and began to type. I was not writing a diary entry. I was drafting a formal whistleblower report. I addressed it simultaneously to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service and the White Collar Crimes Unit of the FBI. I did not use emotional language. I did not use exclamation points. I used the language of the statute. I cited Section 7201 of the Internal Revenue Code regarding willful attempts to evade or defeat tax. I detailed the structure of the shell companies, the inflation of assets for loan collateral, and the deflation of the same assets for tax reporting. I attached the scanned documents Silas had given me, highlighting the forged signatures and the circular flow of funds. I hit send, routing the packet through a server in Switzerland to ensure my anonymity. But the law moves slowly, and I needed immediate chaos. I navigated to the 3 most popular real estate investment forums in the Midwest. These were the digital water coolers, where private equity partners, angel investors, and high net worth individuals gossiped about market trends. I created a new user account with the handle Auditor0. I wrote a post titled, "The Family Trust Trap: How Established Dynasties Are Using Identity Theft to Leverage Failing Portfolios." I did not name the Lockridges. I did not name their company. I did not have to. I described the methodology with surgical precision. I described a 30-year-old family firm in the Chicago suburbs. I described the specific practice of using straw buyer children to hide toxic debt. I mentioned the specific types of commercial properties they had recently acquired: the crumbling warehouses on the south side, the stalled strip mall project in Naperville. I listed the exact interest rates of the subprime loans involved. To an outsider, it was a cautionary tale. To the investors who held Lockridge promissory notes, it was a terrifyingly specific mirror. I hit post on all 3 forums. Within 20 minutes, the view count spiked. Comments started rolling in. People were tagging their brokers. Panic is a contagion, and I had just sneezed in a crowded elevator. My final move for the night was the most lethal. I compiled a dossier specifically for the compliance department of First City Bank, the institution that held Lockridge's primary line of credit. Banks do not care about family drama, but they are terrified of regulatory non-compliance. I sent a digital packet containing the proof of the forged loan documents and the identity theft directly to the Chief Risk Officer's private email. I flagged it with the subject line, "Urgent Material Breach of KYC and AML Protocols." I knew the protocol. Once a bank receives credible evidence of fraud, their internal algorithm forces an automatic freeze on the accounts pending an investigation. It does not matter who you play golf with. The computer freezes the money, and no human can unlock it until the audit is complete. I closed my laptop at 3 a.m. I slept for 4 hours, dreamless and deep. The next morning, I walked into the glass-walled offices of Stratford and Finch at 8:30 sharp. I wore a crisp navy suit and my usual professional demeanor. I brewed my coffee in the break room, exchanged pleasantries with the receptionist about the weather, and sat down at my desk to work on my legitimate cases. Around 10 o'clock, my boss, Mr. Henderson, stopped by my cubicle. He was a man of few words, stern and exacting. He placed a file on my desk and nodded. He told me that my work on the Van Doren acquisition was exemplary. He said the partners were impressed by how I found those hidden liabilities in the pension fund. He said I had a bright future with the firm if I kept up this level of diligence. I smiled and thanked him. The irony was so rich I could taste it. He was praising me for saving a client millions, completely unaware that I was using the exact same skill set to dismantle my own lineage. I felt a strange sense of bifurcation, like I was living 2 lives simultaneously. In one, I was the model employee. In the other, I was a demolition expert pressing the plunger. At 11:15, my personal phone, which I kept face down on my desk, buzzed. I ignored it. It buzzed again and again, a long, sustained vibration that rattled against the wood. I glanced at the screen. "Mother." I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, it buzzed again. "Bethany," then a text message from my father, then another call from my mother. I did not answer. I did not block them, either. Blocking them would deny me the evidence. Instead, I picked up the phone, took a screenshot of the flood of notifications, and saved it to a cloud folder named Harassment Log. Their desperation was palpable. The forums must have caught fire, or perhaps the bank card had just been declined at a business lunch. I went back to my spreadsheet, typing in numbers for a client, completely calm amidst the digital storm I had created. Then, a different notification popped up on my screen. It was an automated email from the credit monitoring service I had subscribed to the night before. Alert hard inquiry detected. I clicked the link. The report opened. Someone was attempting to open a high-interest emergency bridge loan for $200,000. The applicant was listed as Grace Lockridge. The address used was my parents' estate. I stared at the screen, and my blood ran cold. They were not just panicking, they were doubling down. The freeze at the main bank must have hit them hard and fast. Cash flow had stopped. Instead of cutting their losses, they were trying to dig their way out of the hole using my shovel. They were trying to mortgage my future to pay for their past mistakes, even after I had confronted them. This was not just theft anymore. It was predatory. They were trying to bleed me dry before the ship went down. I picked up my pen and tapped it rhythmically against the desk. They thought they could still use me. They thought I was still the quiet girl in the corner with the plastic fork. I opened the credit bureau's dispute portal. I marked the inquiry as fraudulent. Then, I clicked the button to lock my credit file completely, adding a consumer statement that required police verification for any new credit applications. I whispered to the empty air that if they wanted money so badly, they were going to have to earn it. The free ride was over. The elevator ride down to the lobby of my apartment building was usually a moment of decompression, a brief transition between the calculated sterile air of Stratford and Finch and the quiet solitude of my home. But today, as the doors slid open with a soft chime, that peace was shattered instantly. Standing by the concierge desk, harassing the poor doorman who looked ready to call the police, was my sister, Bethany. She did not look like the golden child of the Lockridge dynasty today. At the dinner party, she had a vision of curated perfection, draped in silk and dripping in borrowed diamonds. Now, standing under the lobby's security cameras, she looked frayed. Her designer trench coat was buttoned wrong. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot that was definitely not a stylistic choice, and her face was flushed with a mixture of panic and rage. She was pacing a tight circle on the marble floor, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm that echoed off the walls. She spotted me the moment I stepped out of the elevator. Her eyes narrowed, and she marched toward me, ignoring the doorman's weak protest. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how I was. She shoved her phone in my face. On the screen was a banking notification, transaction declined. She screamed my name, her voice shrill enough to make a neighbor walking his dog flinch. She demanded to know what I had done. She accused me of being a petty, jealous little brat. She shouted that I had embarrassed her at the travel agency. I stood my ground. Adjusting the strap of my work bag on my shoulder, I kept my face impassive. I asked her calmly what she was talking about. Bethany let out a noise of frustration that was almost a growl. She said I knew exactly what she was talking about. She said the Platinum Visa, the one connected to the family account. She said she tried to book her flights for Fashion Week in Milan, and the card was dead. She said the agent told her the account had been flagged for fraud and shut down. I looked at her, really looked at her. The entitlement was so deeply ingrained in her DNA that she genuinely could not see the crime. To her, money was just something that existed, like air. It did not matter whose lungs it came from. I told her that I had reported the card as lost and stolen because I did not open it. I explained that when a credit card is opened in your name without your permission, the legal term for that is identity theft. I told her I was simply following standard security protocol. Bethany laughed. It was a cruel, mocking sound. She stepped closer, invading my personal space, smelling of expensive perfume and stale anxiety. She called me ungrateful. She said that Mom and Dad did everything for me. She said that card was not theft. It was my contribution. I felt the phone in my pocket. I had started the voice recording app the moment I saw her in the lobby. I needed her to say it clearly. I needed the confession. I asked her to clarify. I asked if she was admitting that she knew the credit card was issued in my name, using my social security number, but intended for her use. Bethany rolled her eyes. She threw her hands up in the air. She said of course she knew. She said Mom told her last week. She said Mom told her that since I was too selfish to invest in the company, they would use my credit line to cover the lifestyle overhead. She said the trip to Milan cost $12,000, and that was a business expense for her brand, which meant it was a family expense. She looked at me with pure venom. She said I had ruined everything. She said I had killed her trip and humiliated her. I felt a cold chill run through me. It was not just my parents. Bethany was not an innocent beneficiary. She was an active participant. She knew exactly where the money was coming from. She knew she was spending my future to buy her plane tickets. I took a step back. I kept my voice level, the volume low, forcing her to lean in to hear me. I asked her if she understood that using a credit access device issued to another person without their written consent to obtain goods or services in excess of $1,000 was a federal crime. I cited Title 18, United States Code, Section 1029. Bethany blinked. For a second, the mask slipped, and I saw a flash of genuine confusion. The law was a foreign language to her. She recovered quickly, shaking her head with a sneer. She told me to stop acting like a lawyer. She said I was just an accountant. She said I was scaring nobody. She said we were family, and in this family, assets were pooled. She said my money was Dad's money because Dad made me who I was. She poked a manicured finger into my chest. She warned me to fix it. She told me to call the bank right now, tell them it was a mistake, and unlock the card. She said if I didn't, Dad was going to destroy me. I reached into my bag. My hand brushed past the laptop that held the evidence of their ruin and pulled out a thick white envelope. I had prepared it that morning, intending to have a courier deliver it, but this was far more efficient. I held it out to her. She looked at the envelope like it was a snake. She asked what it was. I told her it was a courtesy copy. I told her that a formal process server would be visiting the estate tomorrow, but I wanted her to have a preview. It was a civil lawsuit filing for damages, identity fraud, and a petition to sever financial ties. I told her that she was named as a co-defendant, along with Mom and Dad, for the unauthorized use of my credit for the Milan trip and the 3 previous business trips to Aspen and Miami. Bethany snatched the envelope from my hand. She didn't open it. She didn't read the legal headers. She just stared at me, her face turning a deep, blotchy red. She screamed that I was a traitor. She screamed that I was a disgrace to the name Lockridge. Then, she did exactly what I hoped she would do. She gripped the envelope with both hands and tore it in half. The sound of the thick paper ripping was loud in the quiet lobby. She didn't stop there. She tore the halves into quarters, then into eighths, ripping and shredding with a manic intensity until the lawsuit was nothing but a pile of white confetti in her hands. She threw the pieces at my face. The paper scraps fluttered down around us like snow. She spat out that this was what she thought of my lawsuit. She said I could not use my own blood. She said no judge would listen to a jealous sister. I stood there, unmoving, as the paper settled on the floor. I looked down at the debris of my legal work. I didn't feel angry. I felt validated. I looked up at the security camera in the corner of the lobby ceiling, noting the red light that indicated it was recording. Then I looked back at Bethany. I spoke calmly, ensuring my voice would be picked up clearly by the phone in my pocket. I thanked her. I told her that she had just provided excellent additional evidence of destruction of legal documents and intimidation of a plaintiff. Bethany froze. The realization that she might have gone too far flickered in her eyes, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. She scoffed, turned on her heel, and stormed out the revolving doors, disappearing into the city she thought she owned. I knelt down on the lobby floor. The doorman rushed over to help me, apologizing profusely. I told him it was fine. I picked up the largest scrap of paper. It held part of the case header Lockridge vs. Lockridge. I stood up, holding the scrap. The bridge wasn't just burned, she had just dynamited the wreckage. I put the piece of paper in my pocket. Next to the recording device, I had given them a chance to read the warning. Now, they would have to read the verdict. The collapse of the Lockridge Empire did not happen in slow motion. It happened with the violent, cascading speed of a controlled demolition. I had planted the charges at the structural pillars, the bank, the reputation, and the tax records, and now, gravity was doing the rest. By Tuesday afternoon, the air in my office at Stratford and Finch felt electric. I had 3 monitors running. On the left screen was my actual work, a complex merger audit I was conducting on autopilot. On the right screen was the local Chicago news feed. In the center was the dashboard tracking the chaotic data traffic surrounding my family's digital footprint. The first domino fell at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. A breaking news alert flashed on the local business channel. Operations at the Riverview Heights commercial complex in Naperville had ceased. This was my father's flagship project, a sprawling development of luxury condos and retail space that was currently just a skeleton of steel and concrete. The reporter stood in front of the chain-link gates, microphone in hand, struggling to be heard over the chanting. 200 construction workers were on strike. They were not striking for better benefits. They were striking because their paychecks, issued the previous Friday, had bounced. The payroll account at First City Bank was frozen tight. I watched the screen as a union representative, a burly man in a hard hat, shouted into the camera that Preston Lockridge was a thief who was trying to build a castle on the backs of working men. He held up a check that was stamped insufficient funds. I took a sip of my lukewarm coffee. My father had relied on a revolving line of credit to float payroll, paying Peter to pay Paul. I had severed the line. Paul was now very angry. My phone rang. The screen displayed, "Unknown caller." I knew who it was. I had blocked every known number associated with my parents and siblings. But desperation breeds creativity. I picked it up and said nothing. I just listened. The sound of jagged, hyperventilating sobbing filled my ear. It was a performance I had heard 1,000 times before. It was my mother, Eleanor. She was not screaming like Bethany. That was beneath her. Eleanor Lockridge weaponized fragility. She gasped at my name. She asked if I was happy. She asked why I was doing this to them. She said that there had been a terrible mistake with the bank. She claimed the compliance officer mentioned my name. She pleaded with me to call them. She said we could fix this. She said it was just a misunderstanding that had gone too far. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the frozen construction site on the news. I kept my voice flat, devoid of the daughterly deference she expected. I told her that this was not a misunderstanding. I told her it was an audit. There was a silence on the other end, heavy and stunned. The sobbing stopped instantly, replaced by a cold intake of breath. She realized the act wasn't working. Before she could pivot to rage, I hung up. I did not give them time to regroup. I turned to my laptop and opened the folder containing the scanned documents my Uncle Silas had given me in the diner. The federal report I had sent earlier would take time to process, but the state of Illinois was much more aggressive when it came to immediate revenue loss. I uploaded the files to the Illinois Department of Revenue's fraud portal. These documents proved that the consulting fees paid to the shell companies were completely fabricated to lower the taxable income of the main estate. I attached a summary explaining exactly how they were shifting liabilities to avoid state property taxes. I hit submit. The state auditors would be knocking on their door within 48 hours. While I was uploading the tax files, the chaos spread to my siblings. My brother, Tanner, provided comic relief in this tragedy, according to a police scanner thread I was monitoring on a side tab. A disturbance was reported at a luxury car dealership in the Gold Coast district. Tanner had driven his bright yellow sports car to a dealership, attempting to sell it back for quick cash. He likely needed money to flee or simply to maintain his illusions of wealth. But Tanner, in his incompetence, had forgotten that he didn't actually own the car. The title was held by a subsidiary of the family company, and that company was now flagged in the National Asset Forfeiture Database due to my earlier reports. When the dealer ran the VIN number, the system screamed, "Stolen, embezzled asset." The dealer didn't cut Tanner a check. He called the police. I imagined Tanner standing there in his designer aviators, explaining to a patrol officer why he was trying to liquidate frozen corporate property. The car was impounded on the spot. He was left standing on the sidewalk, forced to call an Uber he probably couldn't pay for. Then came Bethany. I had not touched her social media accounts directly. I didn't need to. The internet is a hive mind, and once I had posted the anonymous story about the family trust trap on the investment forums, the amateur sleuths went to work. They connected the dots between the unnamed family in my post and the sudden news about the Lockridge construction strike. I pulled up Bethany's Instagram page. It was a massacre. Her latest post was a tone-deaf photo of her holding a glass of rosé, captioned, "Manifesting Abundance." Underneath, the comments were scrolling faster than I could read. "Pay your workers," one user wrote. "Is this the trip you paid for with your sister's stolen identity?" asked another. "Fraud. My dad worked on your dad's site and didn't get paid. Enjoy the wine while you can." Bethany was deleting comments as fast as she could, but for every one she deleted, 3 more appeared. Her sponsors, a tea detox company and a luggage brand, were already tagging her in public posts, announcing they were severing ties immediately to distance themselves from the scandal. Her influence, her only currency, was hyperinflating into nothingness. At 4 p.m, my office email rang. It was an external message flagged as high priority. The sender was Arthur Sterling. He was the Lockridge family attorney, a man who had been cleaning up my father's messes since the 80s. He was the one who drafted the NDAs and buried the bodies. The subject line read, "Urgent proposal for settlement." I opened it. The tone was oily and patronizing. "Mr. Sterling wrote that he was distressed to hear about the interfamilial friction. He suggested that we all take a deep breath. He invited me to lunch tomorrow at the Palmer House, just the 2 of us. He hinted that my parents were willing to offer a generous cash settlement to resolve these clerical errors regarding my credit history, provided I signed a document retracting my statements to the authorities. He wanted to buy my silence with money they didn't have, over a steak I wouldn't eat. He wanted to get me in a room where he could charm me, threaten me, or gaslight me without a paper trail. I hit reply. I did not type a greeting. I wrote that I was declining his invitation. I stated that from this moment forward, I would not engage in any verbal communication with him or his clients. I instructed him that all settlement offers, inquiries, or threats must be submitted in writing and filed through the proper legal channels connected to the pending civil suit Lockridge versus Lockridge. I added that any further attempts to contact me informally would be forwarded to the FBI as evidence of witness tampering. I pressed send. I stood up and walked to the window of my office. The sun was setting over Chicago, casting long shadows across the skyscrapers. Down on the street, the city was moving, alive and indifferent to the destruction of one wealthy family. My parents were trapped in their mansion with no credit, no cash, and the state authorities closing in. Tanner was careless. Bethany was canceled, and their lawyer had just been shut out. I watched a train snake its way along the elevated tracks. The momentum was unstoppable now. I had tipped the first domino, but the kinetic energy had taken on a life of its own. I wasn't just watching them fall. I was watching them shatter. And for the first time in 29 years, the silence in my head wasn't lonely. It was victorious. The underground parking structure of Stratford and Finch was a cavern of concrete and shadows, usually a place of quiet transition between the high-pressure stakes of the boardroom and the solitude of the commute home. But as I walked toward my car on Wednesday evening, the silence felt heavy, pressurized. The echo of my heels against the oil-stained pavement sounded too loud, like a metronome counting down to something violent. I was 10 feet away from my sedan when a figure detached itself from the darkness behind a concrete pillar. It was Preston Lockridge. My father did not look like the titan of industry who had held court at the dinner party just 4 days ago. He looked like a man unraveling. His silver hair, usually coiffed to perfection, was wild and windblown. His bespoke suit, which cost more than most people earned in a month, was wrinkled and stained at the lapel, but it was his eyes that stopped me. They were bloodshot, rimmed with the raw, red exhaustion of a man who had not slept in 72 hours. They were not the eyes of a father looking at his daughter. They were the eyes of a cornered animal looking at a predator. He blocked my path to the driver's side door. He smelled of scotch and stale fear. He hissed my name. It sounded like a curse. He stepped closer, invading my personal space with a manic energy that made my skin crawl. He asked me if I thought I was clever. He asked if I thought I could burn down his legacy and walk away clean. I tightened my grip on my briefcase. I did not step back. I looked him dead in the eye and told him to move. Preston laughed, a jagged, broken sound that echoed off the low ceiling. He leaned in, his face inches from mine. He told me that he was going to destroy me. He said he had already made calls. He said he was going to tell everyone, my bosses, the board, the press, that I was mentally unstable. He would say I had a history of delusions. He would say I was a vindictive, hysterical woman who invented numbers to hurt her family because she felt neglected. He said he would make sure no firm in Chicago ever hired me to audit a lemonade stand, let alone a corporation. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but I forced it down, channeling it into the cold, hard demeanor of the auditor. I let him finish his tirade. Then, he said the words that justified everything I had done. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into the wool of my coat. He snarled that he had raised me. He said he paid for the food in my stomach and the roof over my head for 18 years. He said that gave him the right to use my name however he saw fit. He looked me in the face and said that I was his property. He said I was an asset of the Lockridge estate, and assets do not get to speak. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up at his face. I did not shout. I did not cry. I spoke with the absolute, terrifying calm of someone who holds all the cards. I pointed a finger toward the ceiling, directly at a black dome mounted on the concrete beam above us. I told him that was security camera number 4. I explained that it was recorded in 4,000 pixel resolution with high-fidelity audio. I told him that he was currently on record physically assaulting and threatening a senior forensic auditor employed by a federal contractor on private corporate property. Preston's eyes flicked up to the camera. His grip on my arm loosened slightly. I continued, my voice sharp as a scalpel. I asked him if he wanted to add a felony stalking charge and workplace harassment to the laundry list of crimes the FBI was already building against him. I asked him if he thought a judge would grant bail to a man who threatened a witness in an active fraud investigation. Before he could answer, the heavy steel door of the elevator bank burst open. Frank, the head of building security, came running out with 2 other guards. I had alerted security the moment my father's name appeared on the visitor log at the front desk earlier that day, instructing them to watch the garage. Frank shouted for Preston to step away from the vehicle. Preston released me as if I were radioactive. He stumbled back, looking between me and the approaching guards. The mask of the powerful patriarch slipped completely, revealing a scared, pathetic old man. He pointed a shaking finger at me. He swore that I would regret this. He said I was dead to him. I unlocked my car door. I told him that I had been dead to him for years. I was just finally making it official on paper. I watched from the safety of my locked car as Frank escorted my father out of the garage. Preston was still shouting threats that no one was listening to. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I took 3 deep breaths. In, out. In, out. My phone buzzed. It was a text message from the executive assistant on the 40th floor. Mr. Henderson needs to see you in his office. Immediately. My heart skipped a beat. The adrenaline from the confrontation with my father turned into a cold dread. Preston had been loud. The scene in the garage would be in the security report. High-end financial firms like Stratford and Finch despised drama. They valued discretion above all else. If my family baggage was spilling onto company property, I was a liability. I checked my makeup in the rearview mirror, fixed my collar, and took the elevator back up to the executive suite. Mr. Henderson's office was a vast expanse of glass and mahogany, overlooking the Chicago skyline. He was sitting behind his desk, reading a file. He did not look up when I entered. He gestured for me to sit. I sat on the edge of the leather chair, bracing myself for the severance package. I prepared my defense. I was ready to argue that my work was impeccable regardless of my personal life. Mr. Henderson closed the file and took off his reading glasses. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. He said that a very interesting conflict of interest had just landed on his desk. I held my breath. He continued. He said that First City Bank, the institution that held the majority of the Lockridge debt, had just retained Stratford and Finch on an emergency basis. He said the bank's internal compliance team had received credible intelligence regarding massive fraud within the Lockridge accounts. They wanted an independent, third-party forensic audit to trace the assets before they could be moved offshore. They specifically requested our firm because of our reputation for ruthlessness. He looked me in the eye. He said that technically, as a Lockridge, I was conflicted out of this engagement. He asked if I had any knowledge of the situation that I wanted to share before he assigned the team. I realized then that he didn't know I was the source. He thought I was just a bystander caught in the crossfire. I reached into my bag. I bypassed the tissues and the personal items. I pulled out a heavy, encrypted black flash drive. This was the master copy of Project Icarus. It contained the IP logs, the forged signatures, the tax returns from Uncle Silas, the credit report tracking, and the shadow profiles. I placed the drive on the polished mahogany desk. It made a solid, authoritative click. I told Mr. Henderson that he did not need to assign a team to start from scratch. I told him the work was already done. I explained that the credible intelligence the bank received came from me. I told him that for the past 72 hours, I had been conducting a parallel investigation into the Lockridge estate to protect my own financial identity. I told him that the drive contained a complete forensic mapping of the shell companies, the money laundering routes, and the proof of identity theft. I told him I could prove my parents were embezzling loan funds to maintain a lifestyle they could no longer afford. I sat up straighter. I told him that I understood I could not be the lead auditor on the official case due to the conflict of interest. However, I was formally offering this data to the firm to aid in the bank's recovery efforts. I said I was not asking for credit. I was asking for the truth to be on the record. Mr. Henderson stared at the flash drive, then at me. For the first time in 5 years, I saw his stoic expression break. He looked impressed. Actually, he looked stunned. He picked up the drive, weighing it in his hand. He asked if I understood what I was handing him. He said this was enough to put my parents in federal prison for 20 years. I nodded. I told him that they made their choice when they decided my life was the price of their comfort. Mr. Henderson placed the drive into his secure safe. He leaned forward. He told me that I was right. I could not be on the official team, but he said he was going to make me a special consultant to the investigation. He said the firm would insulate me. He promised that if my father or anyone else tried to come near me or threaten my employment again, they would have to go through the Stratford and Finch legal department, which was a pack of wolves far more dangerous than anything my father could hire. He told me to go home and get some sleep. He said that tomorrow we were going to war, and he was glad I was on his side. I walked out of the office. My knees felt weak, not from fear, but from relief. The worst thing my father could threaten me with, the destruction of my career, was gone. In trying to break me, he had inadvertently given me the ultimate promotion. I wasn't just his daughter anymore. I was the star witness for the prosecution. The morning the story broke, the city of Chicago seemed to hold its breath. I was sitting at my desk at Stratford and Finch, a fresh cup of black coffee steaming in my hand, when the notification lit up my monitors. It was not a small blurb in the back pages of the business section. It was the centerpiece of the Chicago Tribune, a sprawling, multi-page exposé written by Julian Hayes, the Pulitzer Prize-winning economic journalist who had received my anonymous dossier 3 days earlier. The headline was bold, black, and unforgiving. Paper Empire: How the Lockridge Family Built a Castle on the Identities of Their Kin. I clicked on the article. It was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. Hayes had not just reprinted the documents I sent. He had woven them into a narrative of greed that was almost Shakespearean in its scope. He described the 33rd anniversary dinner in excruciating detail, contrasting the menu of truffle risotto and aged beef with the financial rot beneath the floorboards. The article peeled back the curtain on the 33 relatives who had sat in that dining room. It revealed the ugly truth that I had suspected, but never fully confirmed until I saw the bank records. They were not all innocent bystanders. Hayes named names. He exposed cousin Alistair, the one who had made a snide comment about my off-the-rack dress. The article revealed that Alistair had been receiving a monthly consulting retainer of $5,000 from a Lockridge shell company for the past 10 years. Despite having no discernible job, he was complicit. He was taking hush money to look the other way while my parents cooked the books. Then there was Aunt Caroline, who had clutched her pearls when I was disinherited. The report showed that her signature was on the incorporation papers for an offshore entity in the Cayman Islands that was used to siphon off construction loans. She wasn't just an aunt, she was a bagman. But the article also highlighted the victims. It told the story of a long-suffering sibling, clearly my Uncle Silas, whose identity had been hijacked to accrue hundreds of thousands of dollars in tax liens. It painted a picture of a family that cannibalized its own to maintain the illusion of aristocracy. As I read the words, I felt a physical weight lift off my chest. For decades, the shame of being the failure, the outsider, the poor relation, had been a heavy cloak I wore every day. My parents had convinced everyone, including me, that I was the problem. But looking at the undeniable facts laid out in black and white, the shame evaporated. It did not belong to me. It belonged to them. I was not the black sheep. I was the only one in the flock who wasn't diseased. By noon, the fallout had moved from the news cycle to the markets. The reaction was swift and brutal. 2 major pension funds that had invested in Lockridge development projects announced they were freezing all capital and launching immediate audits. The stock price of the regional banks that had lent to my father plummeted as investors realized their exposure to the toxic Lockridge debt. Real estate contracts for 3 pending luxury developments were canceled via public press releases. The name Lockridge, which yesterday meant luxury and exclusivity, now meant radioactive toxicity. But the most satisfying part was watching the alliance of the 33 relatives disintegrate. According to the chatter on the social media feeds I was monitoring, the family group chat from which I had been excluded years ago was in meltdown. The unity my mother had preached about was a lie. Now that the ship was sinking, the rats were turning on each other. Cousin Alistair was reportedly telling anyone who would listen that he didn't know the money was dirty, claiming he thought it was a gift. Aunt Caroline was threatening to sue Preston for mismanaging her investments, conveniently forgetting her signature on the fraud documents. They were calling lawyers, calling the press, and calling the district attorney, all trying to cut deals to save their own skins. They were pointing fingers at my parents with the speed of desperate people who realized the free ride was over. At 2:00, my office phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I picked it up. "Grace?" The voice was shaky, filled with tears. It was Uncle Silas. I asked him if he was okay. He laughed, a sobbing, relieved sound. He told me that he had done exactly what I said. He went to the authorities the moment the news broke. He showed them the documents. He told them about the hospital visit. He said the investigator told him that because he came forward voluntarily and provided the historical context for the fraud, he was being treated as a cooperating witness, not a suspect. He was not going to jail. He was going to testify. He thanked me. He said I saved his life. He said he was going to buy a small ticket to Arizona and live with his sister, far away from Chicago and the Lockridge madness. I told him he deserved peace. I hung up, feeling a rare warmth in my chest. I had saved the one person worth saving. An hour later, the circus reached its climax. On the television mounted on the wall of the Stratford and Finch bullpen, a breaking news banner flashed red. Lockridge Press Conference Live. I walked over to the screen, mug in hand, joined by a few colleagues who had no idea of my connection to the woman on the TV. My mother, Eleanor, stood on the steps of the family estate. She was wearing a white suit, a calculated choice to project innocence. Her hair was perfect, but her eyes were wild. Microphones were shoved in her face. She began to speak. She tried to channel the imperious matriarch one last time. She claimed the allegations were fake news and malicious slander, orchestrated by jealous competitors. She tried to cry, dabbing at her dry eyes with a handkerchief. She said the family was the victim of a witch hunt, but she had miscalculated the audience. The crowd gathered at the bottom of the steps wasn't just reporters. It was creditors. It was the unpaid construction workers. It was the contractors who had been stiffed. A man in a plaid shirt shouted over her, asking where his $50,000 was. Another woman screamed that Eleanor was a thief. The composure cracked. Eleanor looked panicked. She tried to retreat, but the crowd surged forward. A tomato? Or perhaps an egg? It was hard to tell. On the screen flew from the back of the crowd and splattered against the pristine white lapel of her suit. The security guards rushed her back inside the mansion, slamming the heavy oak doors against the angry mob. The image of my mother, terrified and stained, fleeing from the people she had exploited, was broadcast to millions. I took a sip of my coffee. It was still warm. I felt completely detached. I was watching a nature documentary, a scene of a predator finally being cornered by the herd. My personal cell phone buzzed on the desk. I looked down. A text message from Father. I opened it. The message was short, typed in all caps. "You killed this family." I stared at the words. He still didn't get it. He still thought the family was a living thing that could be killed, rather than a parasite that had been feeding on its host for too long. He blamed the surgeon for the blood, not the cancer that required the operation. I typed my reply slowly, savoring every letter. "No, I just buried the corpse that you and Mom have been hiding in the closet for 30 years. I hit send. Then, I blocked the number. I turned back to my computer, opened a spreadsheet for a legitimate client, and went back to work. The audit was complete. The liquidation was in progress. The federal raid on the Lockridge estate began at 6 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday. It was not the dramatic, guns-drawn assault one might see in a Hollywood movie. It was something far more terrifying, a silent, synchronized swarm of dark windbreakers marked with the yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS. I watched the live feed from the news helicopters circling overhead while sitting in the secure conference room at Stratford and Finch, sipping a cup of green tea. The agents moved with the efficiency of a colony of ants dismantling a fallen sugar cube. They were not there for people. They were there for paper. They carried out box after box of files, hard drives, and servers. At 8:30, my phone rang. It was Special Agent Miller, the lead investigator on the case. He sounded frustrated. He told me that they had secured the physical servers from the safe room, but the primary accounting database was encrypted with a 256-bit key. Their tech team estimated it would take weeks to brute force the password. I asked him to put me on speaker. I told him to try a specific phrase. I told him to type Queen Eleanor, 1990, with a capital Q and a capital E. There was a pause on the line, followed by the clicking of a keyboard. Then, a sharp intake of breath. Agent Miller came back on the line. He asked how I knew. I explained that my mother was a creature of extreme vanity and habit. 1990 was the year she was featured on the cover of a local society magazine. The highlight of her life. She believed she was royalty, and she never changed her passwords because she believed she was too important to be hacked. With the files unlocked, the scope of their crimes expanded instantly. It wasn't just bank fraud and tax evasion. The decrypted ledgers revealed a new, darker layer of depravity. My parents had been serving as the treasurers for the Lake Forest Children's Relief Fund, a local charity designed to help underprivileged youth. The ledger showed that over the past 5 years, they had systematically siphoned off nearly $400,000 from the fund. They had used money meant for pediatric surgeries and school supplies to pay for the landscaping of the estate and the lease on Tanner's sports cars. This discovery killed whatever lingering shred of guilt I might have felt. Stealing from a bank was one thing. Stealing from sick children was a level of moral bankruptcy I had not anticipated. 2 days later, The legal war moved from the estate to the deposition room. I had filed a civil lawsuit running parallel to the criminal investigation. My suit demanded a complete severance of my financial identity from the Lockridge estate, immediate restitution for the credit fraud, and punitive damages for the years of identity theft. The deposition was held in a neutral law office downtown. My parents were present, flanked by their criminal defense attorney, a man named Mr. Thorne, who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Eleanor and Preston sat on the other side of the long glass table. They looked diminished. Without their estate, without their staff, without their projected aura of wealth, they were just two angry, frightened elderly people in ill-fitting suits when the questioning began. Eleanor attempted her final gambit. It was a move I had predicted days ago, when my lawyer asked her about the manipulated spreadsheets that hid the embezzlement. Eleanor straightened her back and pointed a shaking finger directly at me. She stated, under oath, that she did not understand accounting. She claimed that she was just a mother and a housewife. She said that Grace was the auditor. She said that Grace was the financial genius of the family. She alleged that I had set up the system, that I had manipulated the numbers to frame them because I was jealous of my siblings. The room went quiet. It was a vicious lie, designed to use my own professional competence as a weapon against me. I did not speak. I simply nodded to my lawyer. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick binder. He slid it across the table to Mr. Thorne. He explained that this was a certified audit trail from the Lockridge Company server, verified by an independent third-party forensic team. He explained that in modern computing, every login, every keystroke, and every file access is time-stamped and user-stamped. My lawyer opened the binder to the summary page. He read the findings aloud. He stated that the user profile associated with Grace Lockridge had not logged into the system a single time between the years of 2015. He pointed out that every single fraudulent entry, every altered invoice, and every wire transfer was authorized by a user profile named Admin Eleanor, originating from an IP address located within the master bedroom of the Lockridge estate. He looked at my mother. He asked her if she would like to amend her statement, reminding her that perjury in a federal deposition carried a mandatory prison sentence. Eleanor turned pale. She slumped back in her chair, the fight draining out of her. The trap had snapped shut. She had tried to frame the one person in the room who knew how to prove she wasn't there. During the recess, I overheard Mr. Thorne talking to my parents in the hallway. The door was slightly ajar. His voice was low and urgent. He was advising them to take a plea deal. He told them the evidence was overwhelming. He said that if they pleaded guilty now, he might be able to get the sentence down to 5 to 7 years in a minimum security facility. My father's voice boomed in response, loud and delusional. He refused. He said Lockridge did not plead guilty. He said they would fight this to the Supreme Court. He believed his own myth until the very end, convinced that his name alone would shield him from the consequences of his actions. As I left the deposition room, I walked down the marble corridor toward the elevators. A figure was sitting on a bench near the water fountain. It was Bethany. She looked nothing like the sister I knew. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a simple pair of jeans and a nondescript sweater. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, revealing dark circles under her eyes. She had been dropped by her agency, her sponsors, and her fiancé within 48 hours of the scandal breaking. She stood up when she saw me. She didn't scream. She didn't attack. She looked terrified. She walked over to me, her hands clasping and unclasping. She begged me to help her. She said she had nothing. She said the bank had repossessed her apartment because the lease was guaranteed by the company. She said she had $60 in her bank account. She asked me for a loan. Just $5,000, she said. Just enough to get settled somewhere until this blew over. I looked at her. I felt a twinge of pity, but it was the kind of pity one feels for a child who has finally been told no after a lifetime of yes. Giving her money now would not help her. It would only enable the delusion that she was entitled to be saved. I shook my head. I told her that I would not give her a dime. Bethany started to cry. Ugly, heaving sobs. She asked what she was supposed to do. She asked how she was supposed to survive. I adjusted my bag on my shoulder. I told her that she was an able-bodied 26-year-old woman with a college degree. I told her to do exactly what I did when I left that house 10 years ago. I told her to get a job. I suggested she try waiting tables or working in retail. I told her that earning a paycheck for the first time in her life would be the best thing that ever happened to her. I walked past her, leaving her weeping in the hallway. It wasn't cruelty. It was the first honest advice she had ever received. The next day, the presiding judge issued a preliminary injunction. The ruling was swift and absolute. The court ordered a complete asset freeze on all holdings connected to Preston and Eleanor Lockridge, including the estate, the cars, the jewelry, and the remaining cash in the accounts. The judge appointed a federal receiver to take control of the company to oversee the liquidation and restitution to the creditors. My parents were officially destitute. They were confined to the estate, which was now technically the property of the government, wearing electronic ankle monitors while they awaited trial. They were prisoners in the castle they had built on sand. I sat in the back of the courtroom as the gavel came down. The sharp wooden crack echoed through the room like a gunshot. It signaled the end of the Lockridge dynasty and the beginning of justice. The legal procedure was over. All that remained was the final act. The sentencing hearing took place on a crisp Tuesday morning in mid-March. The federal courthouse was packed. A sea of reporters, creditors, and the curious public who had been following the downfall of the Lockridge dynasty in the papers. I sat in the back row, wearing a simple gray suit, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I was not there to testify today. I was there to witness the closing of the ledger. The judge, a stern woman with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, did not waste time with theatrics. She read the verdict with the dry precision of an accountant. Preston and Eleanor Lockridge were found guilty on 24 counts of wire fraud, 12 counts of tax evasion, and 6 counts of aggravated identity theft. When the sentence was handed down, 15 years in federal prison for my father and 12 years for my mother. The room did not gasp. It exhaled. It was the sound of air being let out of a balloon that had been inflated for far too long. I watched as the bailiffs moved in. There was a metallic click as the handcuffs were fastened around my father's wrists. For the first time in his life, Preston Lockridge could not buy his way out of a room. He looked back at the gallery, scanning the faces for someone to save him, but he found no allies. His eyes met mine for a brief second. There was no anger left in them, only a vast, terrifying confusion. He still could not understand how the daughter he had dismissed as a clerk had become the architect of his cell. My mother did not look back. She stared straight ahead, her face a mask of shock, as if she were waiting for the director to yell cut on a bad scene. As they were led out the side door, I expected to feel a surge of triumph. I expected the rush of victory, but as the heavy door clicked shut behind them, removing them from my life, I felt something far more profound. I felt quiet. It was a silence that wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was the clean, weightless silence of a debt finally marked paid in full. The invisible chain that had tethered me to their approval and their abuse for 29 years had been severed. The aftermath was swift. The government moved in to liquidate the assets. The auction of the Lockridge estate was the social event of the season, though not in the way my mother would have wanted. Strangers tramped through the grand halls, bidding on the furniture, the art, and yes, even the silver that I had been forbidden to touch. My civil lawsuit was settled out of the remaining scraps of the estate before the government took the rest. After the lawyers took their fees and the primary creditors were satisfied, the check that landed in my hand was not a fortune. It was $40,000. To my parents, that sum would have been a rounding error, a weekend shopping trip. To me, it was seed money. I did not buy a new car. I did not move to a penthouse. I took that check and walked into a bank, a different bank, and opened a charitable trust. I named it the Vance Scholarship Fund, dedicated to providing tuition assistance for students who had been financially cut off or estranged from their families. I wanted to ensure that the next time a young person was told they were a liability, they would have the resources to prove they were an asset. Then came the final administrative task. I stood before a clerk at the county records office, raising my right hand to swear an oath. The paperwork was simple, but the transformation was total. I signed the document that legally stripped the name Lockridge from my identity. I took the maiden name of my grandmother, the only woman in that cursed bloodline who had ever shown me kindness before she passed. When I walked out of that building, I was no longer Grace Lockridge, the unwanted daughter. I was Grace Vance. 3 weeks later, I packed the last box in my Chicago apartment. The lease was up, and I had no intention of renewing. I loaded the trunk of my sedan and drove north, toward the highway. But before I left the city limits, I made one detour. I pulled up to the iron gates of the estate in Lake Forest. The landscaping was already starting to look wild. The grass was a little too long, the hedges untrimmed. A crew of workers was busy at the stone pillars near the entrance. They were using crowbars to pry the bronze plaque that read Lockridge Manor off the stone. I watched as the heavy metal sign came loose with a groan of twisting bolts and crashed into the dirt. I looked past the gates, up the long driveway, to the dining room window. I could see the ghost of the scene from that winter night. I saw 33 relatives. I saw the candlelight. I saw the small folding table in the corner where a girl with a plastic fork had sat in silence. But the image was fading. The girl wasn't there anymore. The table was gone. The house was just a pile of brick and mortar, empty and cold. My phone rang, shattering the memory. I looked at the dashboard screen. It was Mr. Henderson. I answered, my voice steady and clear. He got straight to the point. He told me that the New York office was launching a massive investigation into a hedge fund suspected of Ponzi scheme dynamics. He said they needed a lead forensic auditor who knew how to find the bodies buried in the numbers. He asked if I was interested in the transfer. I looked at the workers tossing the Lockridge sign into the back of a dumpster. I told him I would be there on Monday morning. Mr. Henderson welcomed me to the team, calling me Ms. Vance. The name sounded right. It sounded like me. I hung up and put the car in drive. I didn't look back at the house in the rearview mirror. I merged onto the interstate, the engine humming beneath me. The skyline of Chicago, with all its cold wind and bitter memories, began to shrink behind me. Ahead, the road was wide open, stretching out toward the east, toward New York, toward a life that was entirely, undeniably, my own. As the city vanished into the distance, a thought crossed my mind, clear and sharp as a line of code. They had invited me to dinner to make me a liability. They thought they could write me off, but they forgot the first rule of the ledger. In my world, every debt must be paid principal and interest, and the books were finally balanced. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let me know your location and what you thought of Grace's Revenge. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Veronica Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach even more listeners.